There is a letter in the Vatican Apostolic Library, in the series of Dominican provincial correspondence from the colonial Yucatan, written in 1558 by a friar I will call Fray Marcos. His full name is in the document, legible, and his descendants are traceable through colonial genealogical records, which is my reason for not repeating it here, in which he describes sending to Rome. Along with a collection of confiscated objects from a Maya lord's household, a bark paper book that he calls a great map of the northern lands, drawn in the manner of their astronomical books, showing the cities of earth that lie beyond the river of many mounds. A map of the northern lands, the cities of earth beyond the river of many mounds, written in 1558 by a Spanish Dominican friar who had spent 15 years in the Yucatan, describing an object he had received from the household of a Maya lord and was transmitting to Rome because he did not know what else to do with it. I found the letter in 2017 in a published partial transcription in a 1947 Spanish academic paper on Dominican correspondence from colonial Yucatan, held in the library of the University of Salamanca. The transcription was made as part of a project on colonial-era missionary correspondence and cited the letter for its description of Maya astronomical practices. The phrase about the northern lands and the Earth's cities was quoted in full and then set aside without commentary, because the paper's subject was astronomical practice, not pre-Columbian cartography. I read it in a footnote. I have not been able to stop reading it since. I came to the Vatican correspondence from the other direction. I had been working for 2 years on the trade connections between the Hopewell culture of the Ohio River Valley and Mesoamerican material culture, specifically on the presence of Mesoamerican artistic motifs in Hopewell ceremonial objects, and the presence of raw materials that appear to have traveled in both directions along exchange networks spanning the full length of the continent. Hopewell copperwork from Ohio has been found in ceremonial deposits in the Gulf of Mexico region. Gulf Coast shell appears in Ohio burial contexts. The symbolic vocabulary of Hopewell bird iconography has structural similarities to certain late pre-classic Mesoamerican traditions that are detailed enough to prompt serious scholarly debate about the nature and directness of the cultural connection. I was trying to find documentary evidence, any documentary evidence, that Mesoamerican cultures had geographic knowledge of the Ohio Valley mound cities, not as inference from traded objects, but as explicit cartographic awareness. Fray Marcos's 1558 letter is the closest thing I have found to that evidence, and the object he describes, which he sent to Rome in 1558, was catalogued in a Vatican library inventory in 1587, and does not appear in the next comprehensive inventory of the same collection, dated 1623. Between those two dates, a Mayan map of the Ohio River mound cities disappeared from one of the most carefully managed archives in the world. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand what the 1587 inventory entry describes, why the Codex was in Rome at all, who else saw it in the years before it disappeared, and what a Portuguese Jesuit traveler wrote about it in Lisbon in a letter that has been in the Torre do Tombo archive since 1598, in a file that no researcher working on Vatican pre-Columbian holdings has, apparently, ever cross-referenced. I want to be honest about the limits of what I can establish. The Codex has not been located. I cannot prove it survives. What I can show you is a documented trail from a Dominican friar's letter in 1558 to a Vatican catalog entry in 1587 to a Jesuit traveler's description in 1598 to a cryptic notation by the leading American mound city archaeologist of the 19th century in his private journal in 1891. A trail that all points to the same object in the same institution across 3.5 centuries. The Mayan codices are among the most consequential losses in the history of human knowledge. Millions of bark paper and deerskin books existed in the Maya world, astronomical records, historical annals, calendrical systems, geographic registers of trade routes and territories. In July of 1562, the Dominican bishop Diego de Landa presided over an auto da fe at Mayan in the Yucatan, at which he burned approximately 27 rolls of hieroglyphic manuscripts and hundreds of objects. He later wrote that we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which gave them much pain. Of the entire corpus of Mayan writing, 4 codices are known to survive today. 4. Against a civilization that wrote prolifically for centuries. The others are ash, or are in storage in European collections under inventory numbers that have not been connected to their origins, or are in buildings where they have been for 4 centuries under catalog descriptions that don't identify what they are. The Vatican Library received materials from the Spanish colonial enterprise throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. It received books. It received manuscripts. It received objects. It cataloged them in the manner of its era, which is to say imperfectly, in batches, under general categories, with the provenance documentation often separated from the object itself during reorganizations and transfers. Items genuinely disappeared from Vatican inventories during this period, not by dramatic theft, but by the ordinary institutional entropy of managing one of the world's largest archives across 5 centuries of continuous operation. Consider what Fray Marcos's letters says the Codex contained, beyond the phrase about the northern lands. The 1947 partial transcription includes his description of the book's structure. It was a screenfold manuscript in the standard Mayan format, approximately 14 pages in its folded configuration, painted on both sides with pigments including a deep blue that he recognized as the specific sacred color the Maya used for ritual contexts, what scholars now call Maya blue. A distinctive pigment of extraordinary durability produced from indigo and palygorskite clay, identifiable in surviving codices and in Chichen Itza's murals. The images include what he calls the Great Serpent Road, running from the southern cities to the northern mounds, a route map rendered in Maya pictographic convention, showing a geographic relationship between the Maya world and the northern mound city complexes, with intermediate points along the route that he describes, but cannot interpret. He notes that certain intermediate points carry glyphs he associates with water crossing, river crossings, presumably the Mississippi or the Ohio or the rivers between them. He describes circular and rectilinear earthwork forms at the Codex's northern terminus that he compares to the drawings of the great buildings of the ancients, but made of earth. This is a man who had been in the Yucatan for 15 years, who had walked through actual Maya architectural complexes, who understood Maya cartographic representation from direct experience. He is comparing the earthwork forms in the Codex to Maya architectural representations, and finding the comparison accurate. He found those representations remarkable enough to describe at length in a letter that was primarily about administrative matters concerning the confiscated household property, and his description suggests he understood he was looking at something whose geographic claims were extraordinary even by the standards of what he knew the Maya had documented. This is the part I keep returning to, because the Hopewell earthwork complexes of the Ohio River Valley, the Newark earthworks, the Mound City Group, the High Bank Works, the Hopeton earthworks, include circular and octagonal geometric forms of a precision and scale that would have required exactly the kind of centralized planning and sustained execution that Maya administrative culture understood and documented. The Newark earthworks alone cover 4 square miles, incorporating a perfect circle, a perfect octagon, and a connecting avenue of parallel walls, geometric relationships that align to the 6-year lunar cycle with the kind of accuracy that requires systematic astronomical observation across generations. If a Maya cartographic tradition had encoded the existence of these Earth cities in a geographic register of trade routes and northern territories, the forms it would have used to represent them, the circular and rectilinear earthwork images Fray Marcos describes, are exactly the forms the Hopewell complexes present to an observer who understood their geometry. The Codex, on the evidence of Fray Marcos's description, appears to have known what the Newark earthworks looked like. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. Trade networks, travelers, informants, a tradition of geographic documentation that extended the Maya cartographic imagination northward along the same routes that moved copper and galena and mica and shell between the Ohio Valley and the Gulf of Mexico across centuries of exchange. The 1587 Vatican Library inventory is in the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano. In the early catalogues of the Biblioteca Apostolica, the inventory of that year lists, in a section headed Libri Indiani, Nuova Spagna, an item described as Codex Pictus Americanus, Chartis Corticis, Septemcia Folius, Imagines Geographicae Septentrionalis, received from the province of Yucat, N, via the Dominican mission, circa 1580. A painted American codex, on bark paper, 7 leaves, Northern Geographic Images, received from Yucatan via the Dominicans, circa 1580. Fray Marcos sent his collection from the Yucatan in 1558. The interval between 1558 and circa 1580 is consistent with the documentary delays of colonial-era material transmission. Items frequently accumulated at intermediate points before reaching Rome, particularly during the reorganizations of the colonial mission administrations in the 1560s and 1570s. The description matches what Fray Marcos described. Bark paper, the screenfold format visible in 7 leaves, geographic imagery, northern content, Yucatan Dominican origin. The 1623 inventory of the same section does not contain a comparable entry. The Codex appears in 1587. It does not appear in 1623. Between those dates it was either transferred, misfiled, destroyed, or removed. And then there is the Jesuit letter. The Arquivo Nacional Torre do Tombo in Lisbon, the Portuguese National Archive, holds in its collection of Jesuit travel correspondence a letter written in 1598 by a Portuguese Jesuit named Padre Antonio Carvalho, who had visited Rome that year and spent several weeks working in the Vatican Library on research related to the Jesuit missions in Brazil. His letter describes various items he examined in the library's holdings of Libros de los Indios, and one of his descriptions runs to 3 paragraphs, far more than he devotes to any other single object. He describes a large screenfold book on bark paper, painted with a blue pigment of great clarity, depicting a road running northward from the cities of the painted people, through great rivers, to a country of circular and serpentine earthen cities, each shown with the style of those people's cartographic art. He notes that the serpent forms in the Codex are drawn in the Yucatan tradition he recognizes from other materials in the collection. He notes that the circular earthwork forms are depicted at a scale, suggesting the cartographer understood them to be very large as cities. Though made of earth, he appears, from his description, to be examining the same object Fray Marcos described in 1558 and the Vatican catalogued in 1587. He is looking at it in 1598. And then the 1623 Vatican inventory does not list it, and Carvalho's letter, which confirms the Codex was still in the Vatican as late as 1598, has been in a Lisbon archive file since the 17th century, in a collection not typically searched by scholars working on Vatican pre-Columbian holdings, because the Torre do Tombo concerns primarily Portuguese materials, and the Jesuit connection created an overlap that nobody had followed from the Vatican end to the Lisbon end. Nobody, except one person who tried. In the Smithsonian Institution archives, in the personal papers of Cyrus Thomas, the Bay archaeologist who did more than anyone else in the 19th century to establish that the Ohio and Mississippi Mound cities were built by the ancestors of contemporary native peoples rather than by a mythical lost race, there is a travel journal from an 1891 research trip to Europe. Thomas visited the Vatican Library in April of 1891. His travel journal contains a notation, dated April 14th, that reads, "Examine the pre-Columbian catalog sequence, 1587-1640. Significant lacuna in the Northern Geographic Image material. Item present in 1587, absent in 1623. No transfer notation. No disposal record. Sought assistance of a Vatican archivist who confirmed the gap but could not account for it." The item's description in the 1587 catalog is consistent with what I would expect from a Northern Geographic document of Mesoamerican origin. I cannot take this further from Rome. Thomas returned to Washington in May of 1891. He published nothing about the Vatican visit in any of his subsequent work, not in his 1894 report on the Mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, which became the foundational text of Hopewell and Edina scholarship, not in any journal article, not in any correspondence that has surfaced in the archive. The notation in his travel journal, cited in no subsequent publication, sits in the Smithsonian Archive in a folder labeled European Research Trip, 1891. One folder, in one box, in one finding aid, cross-referenced under Thomas's name and nothing else. He had spent his career arguing that the mound cities of the Ohio Valley were built by the ancestors of contemporary native peoples against the loud consensus of popular and some professional opinion that insisted on a lost race. He had won that argument. He did not publish his Vatican finding, whether he chose not to, because he could not substantiate it from Rome, because he feared reopening the lost race debate from a new direction, or because he simply did not know what to do with a gap in a catalog, is not recorded. He was looking for the same codex. He found the same gap. He could not take it further. The gap in the Vatican inventory has been noted during the library's own reorganizations, though never connected to the external sources that would allow it to be named, rather than simply described. An internal report from the 1960s, work on the pre-Columbian holdings, conducted during the modernization of the Vatican collections under Pope John XCA, acknowledges lacunae in the colonial period indigenous manuscript sequence that the organizing scholars could not specifically account for, attributing them generally to the complex 17th century reorganizations of the library's holdings following the acquisition of the Bibliotheca Palatina in 1623. The acquisition of the Palatine Library, an enormous German Protestant collection absorbed by the Vatican at the end of the 30 Years' War negotiations, required a major reorganization of the Vatican's existing holdings in the same years that the Codex disappeared from the inventory. In the chaos of absorbing a massive new collection and reorganizing the existing one, items were misfiled, transferred without notation, and occasionally lost. The Codex disappeared in exactly the period when the Vatican Library was least able to track individual items carefully. That is not evidence of deliberate concealment. It is evidence of institutional complexity operating across 4 centuries in one of the most complicated archives on Earth. The Ohio River mound cities shown in the Codex, whatever the Codex showed, were built by people whose descendants are today's Eastern Woodlands nations, people who maintain the cultural and ceremonial connections to those earthworks that the academic world is still in the process of properly acknowledging. The Hopewell culture that built the Newark earthworks, the Mound City Group, the serpent and bird effigies of the Ohio Valley, was in continuous communication through trade networks and cultural exchange with the Mesoamerican world that produced the Maya. That connection is visible in the objects, in the copper ear spools, and the obsidian blades, and the Gulf Coast shells, and the artistic motifs that echo across both traditions in ways too consistent to be coincidental. What a cartographic record of that connection would mean for the understanding of pre-Columbian North American geography and cultural exchange is difficult to overstate. It would place the Ohio Valley Mound cities inside the known, documented world of at least one Mesoamerican civilization. It would establish that the mound builders and the Maya were not parallel, unknowing presences on the same continent, but participants in a shared geographic imagination that extended across the full length of the continent's trade routes and was recorded by at least one Maya cartographer in a bark paper book that survived the Spanish missions, crossed the Atlantic, was catalogued in the Vatican Library in 1587, and was still physically present for a Portuguese Jesuit scholar to examine in 1598. The Codex encoded that relationship in a form designed to last. It lasted at least 40 years after the conquest that burned millions of its kin. It survived to 1598. Someone saw it. Carvalho wrote about it from Lisbon. Thomas found the gap in 1891. And then the trail stops at a shelf somewhere in Rome that has not been described in any finding aid as containing what it contains. The Vatican Library is the largest continuously operated archive on Earth. It does not destroy things. It misfiles them. Somewhere in a collection that was reorganized in the 1620s, or transferred to a related holding in the 17th century, or separated from its original accession documentation during one of the subsequent reorganizations, there is a bark paper screenfold in the Mayan cartographic tradition, showing a route from the cities of the painted people northward through great rivers to a country of circular and serpentine earthen cities. It is in a building. Buildings don't lose things permanently. They lose them in the space between one catalog and the next. And the next catalog, when it covers the right shelf, will find it. If this is something you need to share it with someone who thinks pre-Columbian North America was a collection of isolated cultures that didn't know each other existed. Because a Maya cartographer knew where Newark was. And the evidence that they knew is in Rome, waiting for the right person to look in the right box.